Dr. Keith B. Wilson is a professor in the Department of Early Childhood, Special Education, and Counselor Education at the University of Kentucky. He is the program chair and director of graduate studies in the Counselor Education program. He served as administrator and faculty member at the Pennsylvania State University, Penn State, for 15 years, and is dean of the College of Education and Human Services at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. During his tenure at Penn State University, he was also the owner and director of Counseling, Consultation, Psychotherapy, and Services, CCPS, in State College, Pennsylvania. He received his BA, his master's in education, and his Ph.D., all of his degrees from Wilberforce University, Kent State University, and The Ohio State University, respectively. As a professor, he routinely teaches undergraduate, master's, and doctoral level students. Dr. Wilson has well over 100 scholarly publications, including journal articles, books, and book chapters, and an estimated 190 presentations at the local, state, national, and international levels. Committed to the ideals of research, teaching, and service, he has been honored with several service, research, and lifetime achievement awards, one of which includes the James F. Garrett Distinguished Career and Rehabilitation Research Award presented by ARCA. Dr. Wilson is a certified rehabilitation counselor, a national certified counselor, licensed professional counselor in Pennsylvania, and a licensed clinical professional counselor in Illinois, and licensed professional clinical counselor in Kentucky. Dr. Wilson has also been active in Upward Bound, Summer Opportunity Research Program, and the Ronald McNair programs, contributing as a workshop presenter, social, and research mentor for over 35 years. These programs are in place to facilitate college and graduate school success for students from underrepresented populations. Dr. Wilson, we're so incredibly honored to have you join us here today. And at this point, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bobo. I really appreciate you and ARCA inviting me to do this webinar. I am indeed honored. Also, it's just great to see folks who actually decided to maybe, I say, break bread and eat lunch, where we talk about multicultural counseling competencies and disability, and with the underscore intersectionality, which is really, really important, right? When we start dealing with people, regardless of what your social variables might be. We're going to get started here, and please be sure to ask your questions, leave your questions in the chat so that they can be addressed at the end of my presentation. Again, I'm glad to be here and also glad to see so many great faces. I see names and some faces. I also want to say shout out to Vicky. I haven't seen Vicky in quite a while, ARCA manager. And so Vicky, is really nice to reconnect with you during this webinar. These are our learning objectives to understand what the multicultural counseling competencies are, to understand how to apply the multicultural counseling competencies to people with disabilities. And I will want to pause here and say that with many of the competencies, the multicultural counseling competencies, the people with disability competencies and other competencies, they can be applied to so many different groups. And the difference will be the specific kind of concerns that these groups would have in order for people to be competent, right? And so that is the knowledge base of one of the three-pronged approach to the multicultural counseling competencies. And last but not least, to understand the application of intersectionality of people with disabilities, and I would say more importantly than all, how to apply the appropriate strategies to facilitate services for all people, including people with disabilities. In fact, when you read about the multicultural counseling competencies, most of the research and also the articles do not connect the competencies to folks with disabilities. They may mention disabilities every now and then, but it's rare. So we're going to spend some time connecting the competencies to folks with disabilities and then other groups as well, because we're talking about intersectionality, right? So it's important to connect those groups and the competencies for better outcomes. Here's the events organizer. We're going to look at the demographics for some of the underrepresented groups in the United States. Definitions, 3 important definitions on the onset. We're going to talk about the ADA definition of disability, enculturation. What is enculturation? And intersectionality. Then there's some facts, 8 facts I think people may already know, but just remind you some really important facts about folks with disabilities that give us reasons for making sure that we advocate more for people with disabilities. Next, we're going to look at outcomes related to folks with disabilities and the intersectionality concerns that might come with that. We're going to detail the multicultural counseling competencies connected with talking about research regarding salient identities and intersectionality. And this is where I'm going to talk about some of the research I've done with, might have been 8 or 9 folks about 4 years ago, that took almost 7 years to get published. And so some of that information, in fact, a lot of it will relate to intersectionality, and some will relate to folks with disabilities as well. I will conclude and then have a Q&A probably around maybe 1 o'clock, 1:15. You've probably heard many times of folks with disabilities. They're the largest underrepresented group in the United States. And many times I would hear that, but I didn't see a proportion of figures attached to it. And so I've kind of ranked folks here. The folks I'm talking about, it's underrepresented group folks by the number of proportion that they take up relative to their population. Adults with disabilities, right, is 27% of our population. However, it's kind of interesting, but this is only adults with disabilities. You know, it's not no kids with disabilities included in that figure. So it's going to be higher. Latino, Hispanics, right, 18.5%. African Americans, 14%. As you can see there, Asians and the subgroup under the Asian culture here, American Indian and Alaskan Natives, Arab, Middle Eastern Americans at 0.5%, and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders at 0.2%. Now, these are some of the kind of ordinary demographics that when you start to talk about underrepresented groups, you might see. There are just so many underrepresented groups that we don't talk about, and I'm not going to list. There's so many when we start talking about folks who are underrepresented and do not receive the services and treatment that they deserve. But I will talk about some other underrepresented groups that maybe you are working with or have worked with in the past. That's inmates or folks maybe in prison, right? That's 30% of folks in jail and prison, right? Report having some kind of disability. And here we see here is cognitive disability. And of course, 2 in 10 prisoners may go undiagnosed. And many times it's not that they're even going undiagnosed. That's a big problem, obviously, right? But the thing is, when you start digging deeper, many of them are misdiagnosed when they are diagnosed as well. And that's something that even in our kind of general society, our general population, we have to be very concerned with when we start to look at trying to find services and facilitate services for people with disabilities. Veterans, obviously, it's a very high population with 17.6% of veterans have reported some kind of disability. And I think that that's another group that is underrepresented and we don't hear a lot about unless you have a family member or friend who might be a veteran and you have those personal experiences. But again, there are a lot of underrepresented groups that are out there that we have to be concerned with. And people with disability, I would think, is one of those major groups because it represents a large part of the underrepresented groups that we see in the United States. Let's look at the definition of ADA. And the next 3 slides will go pretty quick here because I think that most of us already know the definition of disability under the ADA. Of course, there are several definitions of disability, right? Social Security and others, depending on the service. But here under the ADA, it's an individual who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limit one or more major life activities, has a record of such an impairment, and also is regarded as having such an impairment. Let's move to enculturation. Now, enculturation will be brought up many times, and I'm going to pause here for probably about 10 seconds to say that I'm going to repeat myself intentionally when it comes to certain concepts during this presentation because they're very, very important when we start to look at intersectionality, right? And understanding intersectionality and applying really good techniques and information to facilitate intersectionality with folks that we are working with. Enculturation. Enculturation is the training that you get, right, when you are born. Let's say when you are born. And you don't have to be born into a family to be enculturated. You're enculturated even in the military, right? There's certain things that the military would teach you, for example, in order to survive in that culture, you have to do. You have to. If not, you're not going to survive in that culture. And enculturation in the broadest sense is the particular learning that you get to survive in your culture or your group. I do believe that this is the most important term in the cross-culture and multicultural arena, enculturation. One of the things that's really important about enculturation is that many times when we have shared characteristics like disability, race, gender, etc., you also tend to share those enculturated experiences, meaning that depending on, I want to say this as a backdrop, right? Because there is always a pause. If you are in the United States, and some cultures might be a little different, but with the gender, for example, women are enculturated generally the same way, based on race. Depending on your race, you're enculturated in a similar way, right? Sexual orientation, the same things. So what happens is that enculturation process impacts your worldview, right? It impacts how you see the world. And that makes a big difference when you start to you start to facilitate services for people who might be different than you. Folks with disabilities might be different than you, because we tend to project the way that we were enculturated onto other groups. Now, sometimes this is unconscious at a very, very subconscious level in many cases, but still it happens, and it may damage your working relationship, not only with the people that you are serving, but also with colleagues. Intersectionality is the next definition that we're going to look at. Intersectionality is nothing more than the interconnected nature of social variables. And we all have different social variables. We just don't have one social variable. Male, you're female. I'm using the cis, right, definition for gender. You have a disability, your race. I mean, all of these things are described as social variables. And intersectionality says that it is the interconnected nature of these social variables, the independent and overlapping nature of these social variables that may cause problems when we start to treat, when we start to facilitate services. For example, for a person with a disability, a person with a disability could be obviously male, female, an atheist, right? They have more than one disability, right? You name it, right? All of these kind of social variables can be included into one, folks, and we all have more than one social variable. That makes intersectionality, I think, more important to understand and how we can apply the multicultural counseling competencies to our clients and also our colleagues, right? Our colleagues as well. Here are some facts about people with disabilities. There are 8 facts about folks with disabilities. Old Americans are significantly more likely than younger, of course, to get a disability. It makes sense. Americans and certain racial and ethnic groups are more likely to have a disability. Some reasons for that might be those folks will more likely have a lower SES. Connect the lower SES with the kind of jobs those folks might have, the manual labor. So you kind of start connecting things together just with a person's race or ethnicity, or just with a person's SES, right? And you can see why they may more likely have a higher proportion of disabilities in the population. The most common types of disability in the US involve difficulties with walking, independent living, and also cognition. Americans with disabilities tend to earn less than those who do not have a disability. We probably all know that. However, there are exceptions, right? So workers with disabilities earn 26% less than people with no disability. And those exceptions where, folks with disabilities earn typically a little higher mean, right, than folks who might be able-bodied. Here is chief executive officer, lawyers, marketing and sales managers, and also financial analysis, right? Those folks, and maybe some other ones out there, but these are the exceptions to the rule. Disability facts continue. Disabled Americans have lower rates of technology adoption from some devices. And although technology adoption in many of the industries are getting better, we still have some ways to go, right? In terms of making technology accessible for folks with disabilities. Disabled Americans are much more likely than other Americans to have faced psychological stress during COVID-19. And of course, we've all maybe don't want to remember the stress of COVID-19. And even if you're able-bodied, it was stressful. Let alone if you're a person with a disability and trying to figure out access to certain services. That's adding on to the stress. And think about if you were not mobile, right, during that time, it could be more added stress on you. Employed Americans generally think their workplace is accessible for folks with disabilities, right? And many times it's not. It's not. The percentage of U.S. public school students who receive special education or related services has increased over the last decade. And again, we just kind of mentioned and we talked about adults with disabilities, but let's look at kids with disabilities, right? In the K-12 system. And we're going to accumulate all of this information, and we're going to talk about the ways that applying the multicultural counseling competencies can facilitate services, right, for folks with disabilities. In the K-12 education system, it's interesting that 40% of allotted special education services was either undelivered or went unrecorded. Interesting. And not in a good way. Students with disabilities are disproportionately disciplined, right, compared to their able-bodied counterparts. And then we would look at the school suspension, we're looking at, let's say these two populations here, European American, a white population is unrepresented. And you can see the percent in the school districts in the United States. It is 50.3%, right? And the rate that is suspended is 17.8%. Without disabilities, again, underrepresented, 88.3% of the population of K-12 students, only 13.2%, right, suspended. And you look over again where it says Blacks overrepresented, or people with disability overrepresented as well, right? And in that paragraph, you can kind of look at the percentages of the makeup of folks with disabilities, and then also the percentage of suspended rates for those individuals. And that's keeping constant. If you're in public school, private school, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, right? You still find that these numbers can be generalized and they hold up. So our kids with disabilities are having a tough time getting services and also justice. Other outcomes for people with disabilities. Of course, ADA was signed into law over 30 years ago, and there has been some improvement. Obviously, it should be. However, the unemployment rate for folks with disabilities are still high, right? And then we've talked about equity remains elusive, especially for folks of color with disabilities, and who has a SCS position, low SES. And having a low SES makes it very difficult for access to healthcare and other challenges, especially if you are in rural areas. Now, many times folks might think, looking at some of these outcomes, people don't know, they may be ignorant, right? Yeah, they may be ignorant and just don't really know what to do. But then also sometimes it is unconscious bias by healthcare professionals and conscious bias by healthcare professionals, right? So we always talk about, unconscious bias. Yeah, it could be conscious bias as well from healthcare professionals. I mentioned about ignorance, sometimes not knowing what to do because they were not trained. And if we start looking at the prior slide, the K-12 slide I talked about relative to suspensions, many school teachers don't have enough information to facilitate services for folks with disabilities or kids with disabilities, by and large, right? Of course, you have special education teachers, et cetera. But then even then, you still end up with folks with knowledge who might do the wrong things, right? In terms of placing folks with disabilities. That's another concern. We're going to connect those particular two dots later on in this presentation. What are some of the possible educational and vocational accommodations when we start talking about folks with disabilities? And this is really straightforward, right? Making existing facilities used by employees readily accessible and usable by folks with disabilities, right? That's really important to do. And we still have a long way, I think, to go where we have access in public buildings for folks with disabilities. A lot of improvement, obviously, but we still have some ways to go. Job restructuring, modifying schedules, of course, acquiring and modifying equipment or devices can be something that a person with a disability might need. Interpreters, again, you can kind of see that slide, and these are just some possible educational and vocational accommodations that might be needed for folks with disabilities. One of the things that might prevent individuals from getting services, right, is just a person may not look like they have a disability many times. And so if folks can't see that, they may think that the employee or the student is complaining unnecessary. And that has happened many times. In fact, it's still happening. I talk to some of my students, and it happens with them, with some of their professors, and I'm sure it happens in the K to 12 system as well. So many times people with disabilities who need accommodations, who have a documented disability, do not get those accommodations because of a lot of reasons. One might be people just don't believe they need the accommodations. Two, they may not know the law behind the accommodations when folks are in need of accommodation. They don't know that that is a law they must abide by. It's clear that many people with disabilities are not getting accommodations, and folks need help, right? They need folks to facilitate these services for them. Words, not actions. A lot of times we listen to and we hear people talk about their support of certain groups of individuals. Now we're talking now about folks with disabilities, and they also will go a step further and say, we're going to provide training for individuals in the healthcare system so that we can have more positive outcomes for people with disabilities. Or, just an example here, where it says at OSU, I don't know if that's Ohio State University or not, but here it says at OSU, for example, medical students now get education on disabilities every year. That's good. I think. I think a pin in that, just briefly, a pin in that, right? About 27 health, educational, and disability organizations have endorsed the competencies. So we have some talk here. We have even some possible behaviors, actions that people are trying to facilitate services for folks with disabilities. And I will say that a lot of times when we have things in place, we have laws already in place, and we still have many of the same outcomes, right, regarding folks with disabilities. Let's turn to some of the research that can kind of talk about intersectionality and connect the dots regarding folks with disabilities and having positive outcomes of services. And one of the questions that I have on the slide is one question. With learning the multicultural counseling competencies, or it could be the multicultural disability competencies, help the aforementioned organizations, finish my thought, to improve services for folks with disabilities. Now that's the question mark. I want you to kind of think about that answer, write it down somewhere. And then once we get done with the presentation, you can kind of share your thoughts on it. Let's look at worldview and some of the research that me and my colleagues did relative to intersectionality. And of course, worldview is important because enculturation kind of facilitates your worldview. It's how you see the world. I mean, how you see people. In the enculturation process, and specifically here, it tells you who are the good people on the other side of the track, who are the bad people on the other side of the track, who people would you be allowed to play with if you were a kid growing up, right? And so that's part of the enculturation process, which connects to worldview, your experiences, how you see things, how you see the world. And so one of the studies that we did, in fact, it was several studies, and we looked at three categories. We looked at people with disabilities, gender, and race. And we ask these questions about perceived discrimination and also primary identity. Now, both the perceived discrimination and primary identity will connect to intersectionality, and you'll see later on. But perceived discrimination, we ask folks, we all, at some point in our lives, as a question, have been discriminated against. If so, what do you attribute that discrimination to? And so we listed probably about 17 different responses: race, gender, sexual orientation, about 17 responses, right? So we have their answers to that question, how they perceive discrimination when discrimination was put on them, right? Then we have the primary identity one. We all have an identity, and we can probably have several identities that connect to our social variables: a person with a disability, gender, and I say a person with a disability, SES. I mean, all of these things can be a primary identity. And we ask, what is your primary identity? We ask them in these particular questions. Select the group that you might belong to as part of your primary identity. Most people selected variables like race, gender, sexual orientation. However, you do not have to select any of these groups. So a person selected whatever that variable might be. Then we said select a secondary group, a secondary identity, we call it. I'm going to go past it just a little bit quicker because I don't have any data to talk about this point here, but it's important because when we looked at folks in rehabilitation, their secondary identity, interesting. They most selected disability because they're working with disability. They're working with people with disability, and they may have had personal experiences with disability, and many did actually, because this is question number 2, right? A group that you don't belong with, but you have had a personal experience with that group of folks. So a lot of folks in our field as a second identity selected that particular social variable, which is interesting, but probably not surprising. The third question: have you ever advocated going against the grain in a major way for a person outside of number 1 and number 2? And that answer either is going to be yes or no. And these are some of the outcomes of the study, which connects to intersectionality. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and you see them listed here from one of the studies, selected, or more apt to select race as their primary identity when compared to European American counterparts. The male people with disabilities were more likely to attribute disability as a source of discrimination, right? Male. So that's all races included, male. And we actually dug down a little bit, so we kind of weeded out some of this. So this is important in studies. You have a general study and you have all males, but well, what about males of different sexual orientation, gender, not really gender, race, and some other things? Well, we did that. And the third bullet here, Chow, she found that African Americans, Asian Americans, and multiracial college students with disabilities perceive more career barriers than European American white counterparts, attributing the barriers to their race, ethnicity, and disability identities. So that was another study, but that's kind of connecting to what we're talking about here regarding people with disabilities. Okay, so keep that in mind, the outcomes of at least primary identity for folks, right? And then the male people with disabilities attribute disability as a source of discrimination. When they were asked, you've been discriminated before in the past, most of us have. If so, what do you attribute that discrimination to? And the male said disability. Continued, BIPOC were more likely to report discrimination based on their race when compared to their European American counterparts. So now we have primary identity, right? One group, Blacks, BIPOC, are more likely to select race, right, than their European American and white counterparts. And now we're talking about perceived discrimination. So the perceived discrimination, BIPOC, the group, reported perceived discrimination based on race when compared to the whites. Then European Americans were more likely to select perceived discrimination based on gender, right? And then followed by age, sexual orientation, religion, compared to BIPOC. Now, gender had a very, very strong correlation because overwhelmingly the sample pool was mostly white female. So we did break that down, and it's that last bullet. But the third bullet, we also found that BIPOC were more likely to attribute race as a source of discrimination compared to European Americans. That last bullet says that African American females were more likely to attribute perceived discrimination to their race than European American white females who attributed discrimination to their gender. So going back to slide 20 and also slide 21 here, you can see that you can belong to a same group, let's say racially, but you can have different perceptions, right, of experiences based on your salient identity, because that's what's actually coming up. You ask people what their salient identity might be, and most of the time, in our study, you will see a connection between the person's salient identity and what they might attribute perceived discrimination to, right? Very, very interesting. And it makes sense to me. In my head, that makes sense. So the intersectionality between disability and gender and race, we cannot assume that people have the same worldview and may have the same experiences just based on race or gender or disability. It's those other intersecting social variables. If they perceive one more salient than the other, then you can bet your bottom dollar that more than likely, if they're asked a question or if they perceive some kind of discrimination, for example. I mean, a person get mad at you at the grocery store, for example, and you think, why did that person do that? Well, you're asking, well, why do you think the person did that to you? Whatever they perceive as their primary identity, right? They will probably say that variable, right? Yeah, they will probably say that particular variable. Now, this next statement here, I look at time. The tendency to view a person as part of a single homogeneous subculture often results from failure to sufficiently recognize individual differences within a culture, right? And so within a culture, within a social variable here by extension, that people have different experiences, different worldviews, people don't think alike, but you can make a lot of headway. And I will say you can't generalize. You're going to be wrong sometimes, but most of the time, which is 51% of the time, you're going to be correct if you understand the worldview of the people that you're working with, the worldview of your colleagues, the worldview of your, many times we're having many blended families, of your family members as well. And their worldview may be different than yours, although you have you share the same gender, disability kind of general status, it might be different. Now let's go into the multicultural counseling competencies with intersectionality, gender, race, and also disability. And again, I want to kind of iterate about the intersectionality part of who we are, and that the intersectionality will be heightened depending on which variable we think is the variable of saliency for us, right? And the variable of saliency or importance to us is the variable that that we see how people perceive us at work, in our society, how they interact with us. And usually it's not a positive way, but a negative way many times, right? Right. And that's that variable of saliency. Go back to, let's say, that variable of saliency. There's sometimes I hear on the news, hear this a lot, and they say, why is it that those people always talking about race? Usually white folks are talking about black folks, right? I'm being very simplistic here. Why are they always talking about race? Well, that's their saliency of the variable. It's a social variable, right? It's like a person with a disability. Right? You might have a person with a disability who will have that disability as their salient variable, because when they go out, that's how people are interacting with them, many times in a negative way. So it's tough to get away from that. So they don't have any reprieve from it. And so that's why that person with a disability would probably say, yeah, I'm talking about this a lot because I'm interacting with maybe some ignorant folks who might be, ignorant means not knowing, ignorant folks who are able-bodied, who are mistreating me all the time. All the time. So that saliency, when you start looking at intersectionality, is very, very important, right? Because that's what you can address if you were in psychotherapy, for example, right? If that's one of the reasons that people are coming to see you. But it's important to at least recognize the intersectionality of those variables and not assume that because they may be a certain race, gender, sexual orientation, SES, that they have the same thought processes about that in other folks and in a particular group. Multicultural counseling competencies. And many of the competencies are similar. When I say similar, they have these three pillars. They have these three pillars, right? Awareness, knowledge, and skills. The awareness, as delineated by Suna's colleagues in 1992, is awareness of being mindful of your own and others' beliefs, values, and thoughts. And awareness is important because, many of us have privileges, and it's very tough when you are privileged to be able to see you have privilege. That didn't make sense when I said it out loud. It made sense. It's tough to know that you have privilege if you can't see it, because all the folks around you may have the same privilege as well. Race is one. You can learn about your history in school, right? Depending on what race you might be. Gender, I've never thought about that. I didn't have to worry about getting a raise because of my gender. That's gender. Age, people do not assume that I do not understand a topic because of my age. Okay, ableness. You can go into a restaurant without having to call ahead to make sure that it's accessible. Religion. My religious holidays are recognized by my workplace and by school districts, etc. Sexual orientation. I can post pictures of my significant other without worrying about harassment. Right? Social economic status. Now you can afford to buy or rent a house in a safe neighborhood. These are just some examples. There's so many examples, right? Examples of privilege, right? So when we start talking about the multicultural counseling competencies and other competencies as well, awareness is key of your own kind of privileges and being able to understand that other folks might not have those privileges as you. Knowledge is the second pillar. Knowledge, we believe that this category is the easiest to acquire because it tends to rely on information available in books, people you interact with, the internet, etc. Kind of gaining knowledge. So you have awareness, which is important. Knowledge is important. And then you have skills. So once you have the awareness, you'll be able to understand that you have privileges. And then you have knowledge because I'm trying to understand why this other group perceive they don't have privileges, maybe, right? And you can begin to connect those two things together to come up with skills. Okay, now what kind of skills do you have to be able to facilitate for whatever group you're looking at facilitating? Let's say for folks with disabilities, to facilitate services for folks with disabilities. Well, first, let me talk about skills. And skills are the tools that you use to employ to facilitate services for all groups, including folks with disabilities. Right? Now, application. Looking at the application part, application is really important because a lot of times when you're looking at competencies, we've done research on the competencies too. I didn't want to include it in this presentation. There are two manuscripts we've done that with the competencies and skills in particular, people take a leap that with the skills will indicate action and behavior, right? That's on the application, action and behavior. And skills could be actions and behavior, but they're more techniques. They're more actually techniques, so they're separate than action and behaviors, but they're techniques you use, right? Now, the application part is totally different because this is something that's not talked about many times in the competencies, is the application. Now, application is defined as putting behavior and skills and tools to use in a particular context. And then putting those skills and tools together in a particular context will hopefully lead to a better outcome once you apply it, right? Once you apply it, that will be the intervention, outcome of skills and application in a particular context. Now, let's use this as an example, a really quick example about application, because application is something that, again, is not talked about in the multicultural counseling competencies manuscripts. They conflate the action and behaviors and say that that's application, but it's not. Let's say, for example, you are learning CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, right, online. Now let's look at the awareness, knowledge, and skills of CPR. Awareness, covert symptoms. When a person is going into a cardiac arrest, you can kind of observe that awareness, right? You look, they're grabbing their chest. It may not be a heart attack, a cardio, going into some kind of heart attack mode here, but it may be, right? They're getting ready to have some kind of physical pains where you have to perform CPR. The awareness. The knowledge part of this is what cardiac arrest symptoms might be considered major or minor, right? And then looking at the symptoms that people display to know, okay, I have the knowledge, I know what's going to go, I know what I need to do, and so now I'm getting ready to have my specific skills, chest compressions of the head, those kinds of things. So just with the CPR example, the knowledge, awareness, and the skills, we can probably apply CPR. If we notice a person is needing CPR because they're going into cardiac arrest. Let's say that you have the knowledge, skills, and awareness of CPR, but then you start to do compression on the person's leg and not the person's chest. What you think that would be application? No. So you have the appropriate knowledge, awareness, and skills, but the application is not there because you're doing compressions on the leg opposed to the chest, right? So application is putting behavior, skill, tools to use in a particular context for a particular purpose. So there, in the CPR example, is not application, right? So you can have the knowledge. In fact, you can have the awareness, knowledge, and skills, but not bring it home with the application. And application is important when working with people with disabilities, right? Very, very important. So understanding intersectionality, understanding the variables that might be really, really important to understand regarding intersectionality, depending on the group, but it's important with all groups, right? That's important because that will help your relationship with the person and help you to be able to, I think, relate more to a person when you have that knowledge and you're able not only to have the awareness, the knowledge, and the skills, but able to apply it to folks with disabilities. Another part of facilitating services for folks with disabilities and understanding that kind of intersectionality is to validate, right? To validate folks. And I was surprised that many graduate students I would ask, and a couple of colleagues, been around for a while, that define validation. And folks didn't know how to define validation. They were defining parts of validation, but not validation. They would give examples like this. They would paraphrase, say, well, paraphrasing is validation. No, not necessarily, right? It's only a part of validation. Validation is simply providing truth to what a person is telling you, right? Providing truth to what a person is telling you. And that's what validation is. It's more than paraphrasing, responding to emotion, responding to meaning when you talk to your clients or your colleagues, right? It's providing truth to another person's story. I mean, a good example would be a person with a disability. That's a true story. I was seeing them probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and he came into the office and just talked about the frustration of people trying to help them when they didn't need any help, right? And I listened, and this is what I said to validate the person, providing truth to this person's story. I said, it really frustrates you that you have to go through this all the time with people. And you're really just getting sick and tired of it. Doggone it. I might have had some other choice words that I said to him, but that was it. That's providing truth to this person's story. And they said, yeah, that's it. And they went on talking about it more and more. Again, you can do paraphrasing, that's fine, but that's not providing truth to the person's story, right? Right. So we all validate differently, but at the end of the day, you want to provide truth to what a person is indeed telling you, and that will look different depending on the person that is in front of you. It'll be different. I've done it with a lot of different groups, but the concept of validation is vitally important. Let's look at some of the outcome of the kind of the current research here, and some of the information I'm just going to collect down because I wanted to share with you some of the outcomes of the study that we did. We talked about, males, persons with disabilities are more likely to attribute disability to a source of discrimination, and then females with disabilities are more likely to attribute gender to a source of discrimination. I mean, I think you good folks would think about this. why is it that males and females attribute discrimination to different social variables, right? You've been listening, you kind of know the answer to that, but yeah, they do. And these are white males and females. People who share similar characteristics tend to view advocacy easier for that group. Now, this is something that I didn't share prior, but one of the outcomes in our study, we found that people who share similar characteristics, be gender, race, disability, they tended to advocate, find it easier to advocate for that group that shared that particular social variable. Now, 88% of the participants who identified as female, and this is where we get the kind of the outcome. But when you start digging deeper, you find out, oh, well, because the number was kind of a lot higher because of the females in the study, it came out this way. 88% of the participants who identified as female, and that included, again, Black female, believed that discrimination was because of their gender, compared to only 6% of males identified. But when you break it down, that attribution to discrimination was different for males. Right? Because Black males thought it was because of their race. Whites are more likely to report perceived discrimination based on their age, sexual orientation, in comparison to Black and brown people. Right? White females are more likely than both Black and brown male and females and white males to report discrimination based on gender. We talked about that as well. And then Black and brown females are more likely to attribute their race to discrimination than white females, meaning that Black and white females view perceived discrimination differently. Black and brown females say it's because of race. White females say it's because of gender. Speaking of services, when people do not get validated, they vote with their feet. They don't come back. And many times we do not know why they do not come back for services. I found out once why a client didn't come back to see me, only once. And the person told the staff assistant, and didn't tell me, and the staff assistant told me, and I thought, oh, wow, okay, I know. But many times we don't know. And many of the agencies that we work with, even the educational institutions, follow-up people typically don't do. And depending on what kind of follow-up it is, I mean, I'm not sure if people are going to be honest with the follow-up questions of why didn't you come back, right? So we have to find other ways to get that information from our clients. Conclusion and advocacy. Of course, we need more application of the multicultural counseling competencies, and that's all the competencies that are out there dealing with different groups, because many do not highlight the application part of that, and they're conflating the behavior and action part, right? And they're connecting that to application, but application is totally different. That has to do with applying the knowledge, awareness, and skills in a particular context, right? And that particular context can be many things. It can be you've been taught not to shake hands, and well, when you do shake hand with another person, that you should look them in the eye. And you have a client that doesn't. They hand extended, and they do not look you in the eye. So they don't look you in the eye. What does that mean? Right? Well, may not mean anything, may be cultural, but many times we attach all kind of negative things to a person not looking you in the eye when you shake their hand, right? They're not assertive, they're sneaky, they're shaky, all kind of things. So that's important, being able to apply what you learn. People may perceive discrimination based on their salient identity. We talked about that as well. And many times they will, based on whatever their salient identity is. that's how they're going to perceive discrimination. And that helps you. That gives you, I think, a leg up when you start to see different groups of people, right, that this can apply to. Validation is an important part of facilitating services for all people, including people with disabilities. And we looked at some of the stats regarding folks with disabilities, and we understand that many times they're not getting the services they need. And if they have several social variables, and they do, then we have to determine, which social variable, right, this person perceived as salient, because having an understanding of that and also the social variable or variables that they may perceive as salient can help facilitate services for that person. In fact, it can definitely, I think, help validate them in the appropriate way, right? Providing truth to what they're telling you. And that's really important for rapport for you and the client. Advocacy should also be extended to others who may not share the salient demographic variables that you might share as well. Intersectionality is important to remember when working with all clients and colleagues, right? And that includes people with disabilities. But the application, I think, is underscored here because the application is missing. People are talking about providing services for folks with disabilities, supporting the competencies, supporting the multicultural disability competencies, right? Doing the trainings for folks. But the question is, are they applying what they're learning? And many times they're not. They're not applying the understanding of the intersectionality concepts and the identity concepts to be able to facilitate even better for their clients. We know that because of the many outcomes that I talked about early on during this presentation. We know that that's not happening as much in the schools. We know that's not happening as much as it should, even at the post-secondary level as well. Good folks, thank you for your patience and also for participating. I really enjoyed doing this webinar, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this moment, if that's okay. Dr. Bolivar, that's okay for me to?
Hey, Dr. Wilson, yes, that's
Okay.
perfectly okay. And please allow me, Dr. Wilson, to first and foremost just thank you for such a wonderful and informative and meaningful presentation. This was truly great, so thank you first and foremost for that.
You're welcome.
So we did have a request, Dr. Wilson, if it might be possible to get some of your references that you shared, particularly the ones from your study, if that might be able, if we could include that in the chat box.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you. And of course, for those in attendance, if it might be easier to unmute yourself and ask a question directly to Dr. Wilson, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, please also feel free to use the chat box if you would prefer to type in any questions you have.
Yeah, that'll give me the opportunity to get these references. So that's good. That's good.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. And so maybe as people are also typing, we did have a question, Dr. Wilson, that had come up in terms of what have you found to be some possible misperceptions or misunderstanding from counselors as it relates to disability as an intersecting identity?
Yes, I don't think counselors talk about it a lot. They're always talking about race and gender, and those are important, but folks do leave out disability quite a bit. They really do. And it's one thing to leave out disability and not know. That's a problem now. But lesser of the two evils. But it's another to leave it out, and you should know better, especially if you're in this field. And I think we have so many things that we have to talk about in terms of uh, underrepresented groups, but it's important to have disability, I believe, as one of the primary ones. If I'm talking about gender, I just talk about gender sometimes in a workshop. I always include disability. I include about 4 or 5 variables, and I almost never, at least the last 25 years or so, been very cognizant of this mentioning as a passing note to people to say, hey, this is important. Like, okay, he's mentioning disability in here, right? And so I think that that's important, for advocacy, at least to be on the radars of folks. Did I answer that question to the satisfaction of the person who asked the question? I hope I did. If I didn't, just let me know and I can give it another try.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. And I know you started mentioning as it relates to advocacy, what would you say is that role of fellow counselors in terms of trying to encourage and really urge other counselors to incorporate disability and to really consider disability as an intersecting identity?
Yep, I think the part of it could be when you're writing, and your writing is so important when you're doing a lit review on a topic to mention as examples. Oh, by the way, and I do that all the time with different social variables. I use different social variables a lot, but putting disability in there is important, I think. Another thing is important is I'm gonna take my glasses off when I say this. I'm being all dramatic, so it's a Friday. I, advocacy is not easy sometimes, and I we have time. I would share 1 or 2 of my stories, and I don't suggest people do it, but I suggest people do it because true advocacy for any group, it puts you out there by yourself, and that's when you know. That's when you know that you're doing the right thing, but making sure that you're advocating in a way that people understand what they're doing is wrong. Or right. We always, I try to get 2 sides of that coin, right? We keep encouraging people, the stuff that they're doing. That's right. Keep doing that. But wrong as well. I have, a couple of times in my career. It only happened twice. And I'm going against colleagues. One was gender related, disability. Another one was gender related. And if we have more time, I would like to share one of those with you. But you have to take a stand and be not mean, but just have conversations with people. That's what I do. I just have conversations with people. I don't confront. I just have a conversation with them.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that, Dr. Wilson, and as people also may take the time to go ahead and add any questions in the chat box, I think that it would be a meaningful opportunity if you're open to sharing that experience, because I imagine that could also speak to the application that you shared earlier, right? Kind of that notion of application of the multicultural competencies that oftentimes are overlooked as well. So that would be a wonderful experience to hear.
Yeah, okay. So I can share both. Let me share the gender one because that one was more intense. uh, I'm going to share that one first. I can share both. So it was a colleague, again, the kind of advocacy we're talking about all groups good, folks, because we all need allies. It doesn't matter who you are. We all need allies or what group you belong to in many cases. I was a male colleague of mine who was very disrespectful to another colleague of mine who was female. And I've been working in this place for about 12 years. So I knew both of them. They knew me. And I walked into the mailroom. He said something to her. And I looked up. I thought, oh, like, whoa, like he said this. I was like, oh my goodness. And I looked at her. It was a very intimidating. He was trying to intimidate her. I don't know what happened before I walked into the mailroom, but this what I observed. I'm like, whoa. And I said something to him. And then I walked back with my female colleague to her office. And then I asked her this. I said, look, you don't need me to be some kind of knight in shining armor. You don't need me. You can take care of yourself. I know it. I know it. But I'm going to ask you this question. I want to go back to X and say more to him because I'm a male. He's a male. And I think what he said to you and your reaction, it was totally unnecessary. As I don't even want to ask you what transpired before I walked into the mailroom. But what I heard was just, and she said, she looked at me. She said, no, that's okay. That's okay. And I looked back at her. But that's the first response, people not. I said, no, 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 no. I'm serious. And I shut up. I said, no, I'm serious. And once she figured out, looking at me, this guy's serious. She held it together, but she began to almost just emote. And she looked at me and said, no, I got it, Keith. I got it. No, no, thank you so much. She just thanked me. After that, just, And so I understood. I'm not trying to be nobody's shining knight in shining. No, people can take care of themselves, I assume. Sometimes they can't. That's another story, but I saw her as, no, you can take care of this, I think, if you want to, but I wanted to help. And that's one example. And I will tell you this. I'm black. If you don't know, I'm black. I just went outside last 4 or 5 days coming. I got a tan too. So I'm black. I'm black, y'all. I'm African American, right? So you don't know. And my colleagues, they were white, right? European American. So in terms of advocating, I'm not cisgender female. I'm not white. I'm at least 2 social variables away from her. And it happens sometimes. You don't look like the person who you're advocating for. You may not have the same values that they do. It doesn't matter. I believe it doesn't matter. And I'm going against a colleague. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for sharing that powerful story.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, just the importance of advocacy and really supporting, like you mentioned, kind of looking people in the eye when feasible, right? And being able to provide that supported stance is just so powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. One person with a disability, just real quick, two, but one was intimidated by another faculty member, and they wanted me to go into the office with them, so that they don't get shamed or whatever. They was just afraid of this person, this other faculty member actually. the person didn't want to give them the time that they really needed for an exam. They wanted to talk to him about it. And so, yeah, I went in with the person with the disability. I said, look, this is your meeting. It's not mine. It's your meeting. But I'm there to make sure that nothing goes wrong because you invited me to this meeting. I'm going against another colleague, another senior faculty member who's white, the colleague, a white male, and the student was Asian American.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
I was going to say that I still have one of these individuals writing letters of recommendation for me. So we have a good relationship. I mean, we do. Good. I mean, yeah, I don't internalize it. I don't internalize it. Life is too short.
Absolutely. Thank you. And of course, we also want to remind our attendees, if you have any questions, if you would prefer to unmute yourselves, we definitely invite you to do so as well.
Dr. Bulver, I want to find out if I can find the actual manuscripts. Would that be okay if I send those to you and you can send them out? Because if I could, I'm not sure.
Absolutely. So, following today's presentation, we'll be sending everybody a follow-up email, kind of as a wrap up to today's webinar. And so, if that might be possible, we could absolutely include the manuscripts in that email so everyone can have direct access to those.
Okay, thank you. Because I think I have the whole, yeah, have all of them in one place. And I'm thinking if I could do that, I would do it if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
And we did, Dr. Wilson, get an email from a question from a direct message as well in terms of when considering application of multicultural competencies and the inclusion of disability, what is the role of employers in that process, and kind of how would you recommend that counselors provide that level of advocacy and education to employers as well?
Oh yeah, that's a very good question. And we have to, as we do a lot of times, educate employers because sometimes a lot of times they don't know, right? They just don't know, right? Um, Especially all of the laws pertaining to how they can facilitate services for people with disabilities and making room and space for folks with disabilities in those specific locations, right? There are many examples about, these certain locations. You go into restaurants and different kind of things that you see certain folks in. A lot of times it's a national kind of agenda for a food chain, but sometimes it's not. It's a local kind of thing, and they've been educated by a person who understands and works with a lot of folks with disabilities and trying to facilitate them getting jobs. So yes, advocating for folks with disabilities, but talking to employers, right? And a lot of times I think it just is kind of condensed. It's just having a relationship. So before people going to sit down and talk with you and let you drive their car, they want to find out, are you going to damage my automobile first? Are you going to damage the upholstery? So the relationship that you form is important, and you start to just give not only more information, but access to all the stuff that can help them. I think that's the key. That's the key to it. I think sometimes we may make mistakes going in and going to ourselves, saying to ourselves, "Oh, I'm gonna give all this information to them and leave it and come back." That may work, but having a relationship with that person first, if you can, and it's build it, because you have more than one or two people that you want to refer there. You're thinking down the road, it's a strategic kind of thing that folks have to do, I think, right? Very strategic. It's like, I may not get anywhere in 6 months, but what about in a year? What about 8 months? You know, I keep coming back, talking to this person. That's important. So the approach is everything. And the information that we have is invaluable to employers.
Absolutely. And thank you, Dr. Wilson. And kind of piggybacking off of that question, I wonder what recommendations might you have for educators as it relates to helping teach the application of these competencies and incorporating disability within those competencies within counselor training and education programs.
Yes, I'm going to share this with folks. I know this is being recorded too, but I want to be transparent. The competencies, those two manuscripts, I may even send that one, those two actually as well, but it got rejected 7 times because it was going against all the other things that the competencies didn't say. And it was probably an outlier, quite frankly. So it took 5 years for both of them to get accepted in a peer review referee journals. So yeah, it's tough. So when you start to talk about applying, people are used to doing things in a cognitive way. You know, we're going to do training. We're going to do in-services. We're going to do give you something to read. All this is the cognitive thing, and people are taking a leap. They're thinking that if I read it, if I go to the training, I'm going to do something. I'm going to apply. That is as far wide as the ocean to take a leap like that. But most people take it without understanding that, or they understand it, but when you start looking at outcomes, you go, oh, these folks are really not applying what they probably know. And you only know that because now we have more education and more exposure to things, but outcomes are so similar than 20 years ago and 40 years ago. I mean, really, they're in many things, right? They're similar. So letting people know that the trainings are important, the readings are important, having conversations are important, but accountability is more important than all of that in terms of how are you evaluating what you're doing with this group of people? How are you assessing it? And I think that is major for the application. But you have to have a person who understands like the difference, that they can talk to the stakeholders. I mean, I go into a room sometimes and I know that that's my jam. Literally, that's my little, I know because most people are not thinking that way. And these are high level conversations many times with people who are way past my pay grade. And I just calmly explain the concept and explain, you want to do evaluations because of this, and the other. There's a lot of people, a lot of resources you're using up. And I would think you want to know what you're doing and how you're doing to get better, not only for your organization, but for the clients that you are helping. So I've had, many times people do they get it if they're really open. But people are just used to, let me just do this, do a class, go take a class, go take a workshop, and the accountability is not there. Therefore, the application is not there. Usually.
And I appreciate that, Dr. Wilson. It sounds like even similar to the prior question about working with employers. And you said not just providing information and resources and just following up 6 months later, but that continuous follow-up and continue to build those relationships. And so it sounds like even within education, not just teaching the concept, right, but continuing that evaluative process, continuing to follow up on those conversations, and continuing that self-evaluation as well is really important for application.
Yes. Yes, it is. It is. Yeah. And a lot of folks don't know the difference between them. And that's okay. I don't say that it's okay. You just kind of talk with them, talk through it with them. Once once people tell you about the cognitive stuff, because that's all it is, addressing the cognitive stuff, the thinking. And, you know, don't tell me how you think about it. Tell me how you feel about it and how you're going to apply it. That's different. People always asking many times, how you think, what you think, how you feel from here to here. And it different responses.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Yeah.
And we did get a question, a direct message as well, asking if it would be possible to have access to your slides afterwards.
Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you.
No problem. I'll send that. In fact, I'm gonna do once we get done, I'm gonna send it all to you. Probably like in like 20 minutes or something like that, but I'm gonna send it to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So we'll be sure to forward that and access to the manuscripts out to everybody for further review. So thank you so much, Dr.
No
Wilson.
problem. No problem at all.
And at this time, we would just like to provide our sincerest gratitude to Dr. Keith Wilson for this wonderful and meaningful presentation on the multicultural counseling competencies and disabilities, connecting the dots with intersectionality. Dr. Wilson, we're most grateful for you for taking the time to share with us today. And of course, for those in attendance, we appreciate you joining us today, and we would like to invite you to save the date for our next ARCA webinar as part of our month-long June 2024 webinar series, which is scheduled for next Friday, June 28th, 2024, from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, titled Accessibility, Advocacy, and Counseling Spaces, Barrier Reduction, and Community Building. Please be sure to review our month-long June 2024 webinar series program to view the remaining programs that we'll have throughout the rest of this month. We hope you'll consider joining us. And to everybody on behalf of the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association, we thank you again so very much, Dr. Wilson, and we thank all of you for joining us, and we wish each of you a wonderful weekend ahead. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Take care.